My name is Joe Brown, and in 2019, I quit my job as a stockbroker so I could start this, Heresy Financial, where I teach people how economics really works so that you can make more money investing. And it seems like even the chief economic advisor to the President of the United States needs a little bit of financial education, because he was recently asked this very question we're talking about today, which is, why does the US government borrow when it could simply print all of the money that it needs? And I dare you to see if you can watch his response without cringing.
Why does the government even borrow?
Well, again, some of this stuff gets, some of the language that some of the language and concepts are just confusing. I mean, the government definitely prints money, and it definitely lends that money, which is why the government definitely prints money, and then it lends that money by selling bonds. Is that what they do? They sell bonds. Yeah, they sell bonds. Right, because they sell bonds and people buy the bonds and lend them the money. A lot of times, at least to my ear with MMT, the language and the concepts can be kind of unnecessarily confusing, but there is no question that the government prints money and then it uses that money to, I guess I can't really talk. I don't get it. I don't know what they're talking about. Cause it's like the government clearly prints money. It does it all the time, and it clearly borrows. Otherwise we wouldn't be having this debt and deficit conversation. So I don't think there's anything confusing there.
You don't think there's anything confusing there? Well, you certainly fooled me, because you seemed extremely confused. But don't worry, I'm gonna break this down for you. It's extremely simple to understand. We just have to start with the 3 different ways the government can get its income, what the differences are between those methods, so that we can answer the question, why does the government borrow when it could simply print all the money that it needs? All right, so the first way that the government takes its income is through taxes. This is one that everybody is familiar with. You take a look at your paycheck, your pay stub after you get paid, you see, okay, well, I got paid $6,000, but into my checking account, let's say I only got $3,500 because the rest of it just went to Uncle Sam for all sorts of different taxes. The second way that the government can take income is through borrowing. And so they just ask, they say, hey, we'd like to borrow this many dollars. Does anybody anywhere want to lend those dollars to us? Now, this could be China, this could be banks, this could be you and I, but they open it up to the public and they say, hey, does anybody have dollars? And if you have dollars, do you want to lend them to us? If so, we will promise to pay those dollars back to you, plus interest at some point in the future. Again, pretty straightforward, that is borrowing. But there's a third way the government can get income, and that is through the printing press. Now, most people paid no attention to how money printing worked prior to 2020, but nowadays most people have at least a basic level understanding that the federal government has some sort of control over printing, and it can just create new dollars out of thin air if and when it wants. And that's why this question is coming up a lot nowadays, because people are seeing prices go up, people are seeing taxes go up, people are seeing their livelihoods get weaker and weaker. They're seeing their cost of living get higher and higher. And they're saying, hey, what's going on? Government, I want you to step off my back. If you need some money, just print it. Stop taking it from me. Now, before we move on to the details of each of these 3, I do need to make a note about the legality of government printing money. We're not going to really get into the nuances here, but just know the government itself, the US government, does not actually print money. That's the Federal Reserve, which is technically a separate entity. And when the Federal Reserve prints money, it's not even legally allowed to just loan those dollars to the US government. In fact, the US government has to borrow from the private market. It's not allowed to borrow directly from the Fed. So when money printing happens, it happens by the Federal Reserve, and any of that money that makes its way into the government's hands happens indirectly through the banking system. But the reason why we're not really gonna have to get into the nuance of that is because the end effect is still pretty much the same, that when the money printing takes place, an entity that the government somewhat controls prints money, and that money gets its way into the hands of the government, and then the government can spend it. And so even though the legality of this isn't really there, and it goes through some different loopholes and the technicalities, there's some nuance here. Just for all intents and purposes, the government does have the power to print money at the end of the day. That's the end result. Okay, so let's talk about the details about the government taking taxes. Detail number 1 about the government taking taxes is that taxes are a direct dollar transfer from some individuals to the government. Again, this is something people see every single day. When you look at your pay stub, you see that you had money taken away from you and it was transferred to the government. And then the government is then going to spend that on a number of different things. Maybe they're going to spend that on somebody's social security paycheck. Maybe they're going to spend that on somebody's Medicare payments. Maybe they're going to spend that to some military industrial complex corporation that's manufacturing arms to drop bombs on the Middle East. Wherever that money is going, it's going to end up in somebody else's bank account, got taken from you, and it's going to get deposited somewhere else. The second note about taxes is that they are visible, which means that when taxes happen, everybody knows about it. So whether it's a tariff, whether it's a sin tax on alcohol, whether it's an employee tax that's taken out of your paycheck, you know when taxes happen because it's dollars taken directly away from you. They're 100% entirely visible. The third thing about taxes is that they are one for one. What do I mean by that? You get $1 taken away from you, and that ends up being $1 that the government spends somewhere else. So any money that the government spends that got taken from taxes is just a one-for-one direct transfer of dollars from one person to another person. And then the fourth detail about taxes are that they are entirely involuntary. Now, the United States is alone in this. It's the only country outside of one dictatorship in the entire world that has an involuntary tax system. Any other country on earth, if you want to opt out of the system, you simply get to leave the country. You maintain your citizenship, but you leave. You're not taking advantage of any of the benefits that those taxes are paying for. You leave, you go somewhere else, you stop paying taxes. The United States is the only country on earth that does things a little bit differently, and the tax system is 100% entirely involuntary. You cannot escape it. Even if you expatriate and give up your citizenship, you still pay an exit tax. And so taxes are money that is taken away from some individuals, regardless of their choice, no matter what. And this is why they are pretty unpopular, because people see money taken out of their check and they didn't vote for that guy that's taken more money out of their paycheck than the last guy. And this is why people get so upset about this. They're involuntary and they have no choice in the matter. And so taxes to fund especially increased government spending tend to be very politically unpopular. Now we're going to see some of the differences between taxes and the details with borrowing. Some of these are going to be very different. So let's take a look at the first detail with borrowing to fund government spending. Detail number one is that it is a direct dollar transfer from some individuals to the government. So this is the same exact thing as taxes. Some dollars are transferred away from some people and they go to the government and then are spent to other people. So it is a direct dollar transfer from some individuals or entities to the government, and then the government spends it. Detail number two is that it is visible. All of this happens above board. Whenever government auctions take place and they sell off bonds in order to borrow more and more money, this is all happening visibly, and anybody participating knows exactly what's happening. Detail number three is that it is also one for one. Again, this is the same as taxes, which means that every dollar borrowed goes and gets spent as $1 spent somewhere else by the government. Every dollar the government spends that it sourced from borrowing was $1 that it got from somewhere else. It's a one-to-one correlation. However, detail number four is where things change, and this is a massive change. It is that borrowing is voluntary. When the government holds an auction, they just say, hey, we're going to borrow some money. If anybody wants to lend us that money, that'd be great. There is no force applied here. And so this is why many people view borrowing as more preferable, and definitely it's politically more popular because they're not imposing any new involuntary transfers of money away from people. They're just saying, hey, does anybody want to give us some money? And if you do, we'll give you that money back in the future with some interest. And that brings us to detail number five, which is the insidious nature of borrowing. And that is that borrowing must be paid back. If the government raises taxes in order to pay for something, it's just done. They took the money and then they paid for that thing. But if the government raises that money from borrowing, well, then they're going to have to pay that money back. So really the only reason why borrowing even works in the first place is because of taxes. And so usually this is an unfelt or unthought through cost long-term of borrowing, is that the people who are voluntarily giving their money to the government through lending that money to the government so the government can borrow from them, they're going to get paid back with interest on the backs of the taxpayers who are getting their money taken away from involuntarily. But in the short term, in the meantime, when the government's doing the borrowing, most people feel that it is a more preferable option because they don't feel the pain of it right now. And now we get to the third way that the government can get income, and this is through printing. And like I said before, yes, the government doesn't directly control the printer or the Federal Reserve, but for all intents and purposes, when printing happens, that's what is the end result. So detail number one about printing is that it is the creation of new units of currency out of nothing. So this is different than the details about taxes and borrowing, because taxes and borrowing are both direct dollar transfers from some individuals to the government. But with printing, you don't see that. You see new units of currency being created ex nihilo, out of nothing. And that is why this method of funding the government is also the most insidious, because in the short term, it seems like this is the lowest cost. Many people say, hey, this is a no-cost way to fund government financing. We don't have to do a direct transfer of wealth away from anybody. We can create those units of currency out of thin air. The second detail about money printing is that it is invisible, which means that when it happens, because you're not directly taking money away from anybody else, either voluntarily or involuntarily, there is no visibility on that new money creation. Yes, we can see that show up in the statistics and in some government accounts later on, but it is an invisible way to fund government spending, because you could technically print quadrillions of dollars and just leave them in the government's accounts. And until they actually get spent, you won't start to see the effects of that, which we're going to get into later on. The third detail about printing, it is that it is one from many, as opposed to borrowing and taxes, which are one for one, which means that every dollar that the government prints, it is not taking away $1 from somebody else. However, when we look at printing, we have to look at things from the standpoint of purchasing power rather than the number of dollars. And in this way, we can see that for every dollar that the government prints, it is transferring some purchasing power, a little bit of purchasing power, away from all dollar holders. And it's not something that just magically happens or that's inherently happens. That's just a way to describe the mechanics of what takes place when the government creates new money out of thin air and then spends it. And I'll explain those dynamics as well. The best way to understand what's taking place here is to imagine that counterfeiting was not illegal. If counterfeiting was not illegal, then anybody could have a printer at home and you could print out some $100 bills. You walk down to your grocery store and you say, hey, I'm gonna buy some groceries with some of these $100 bills that I printed out. Well, what are you gonna find? The person who owns the grocery store is gonna say, well, wait a second, this is real food and I had to do real work to get this real food. So I'm actually not going to take those $100 bills from you, because if I wanted $100 bills, I could just print them out myself. So I'm gonna have to demand something else from you in payment that is valuable to me, because no longer are $100 bills valuable anymore, because anybody can get any quantity of them that they want simply by printing, which would mean the purchasing power of them would evaporate instantly if anybody could do that. And so if we imagine this as a spectrum, which on one end you have nobody has the ability to create new units of currency, all the way on the other end, everybody has the ability to create new units of currency. On one end, we have the purchasing power is solid and secure and a strong foundation. On the other end, we see purchasing power evaporates instantly, which means that in the world that we live in, where we live in somewhere in the middle, where one entity has a monopoly on the ability to counterfeit money and create it out of nothing, that means that the purchasing power is slowly but surely being transferred and being evaporated. It is simply being transferred to the entity that is doing the printing. Another way to think about this is how you accumulate and build wealth. The only way for you to get paid money is to provide somebody else with value so that they will voluntarily give you some money for that. That might be your time, that might be your skills, that might be your labor, that might be a product that you built. But in order for you to gain purchasing power, wealth, or money that you can use to buy something else like assets or goods or services, you first have to produce and provide some other people some value. However, the US government is the only entity that has the monopoly on being able to get purchasing power without first creating wealth. They don't have to provide value. They don't have to create wealth. They don't have to make a product or a good or a service that somebody else voluntarily wants more than they want the money that they're giving up. The government can simply print those dollars and they get that purchasing power automatically, and they use that to spend, which then they take real wealth away from others. Which means that, again, for every dollar that they print and create out of thin air, it's a transfer of wealth away from all current dollar holders. It dilutes the purchasing power of all existing money. And the fourth detail about money printing is that it is, of course, involuntary. Just like taxes, you don't have any choice on whether or not the government decides to print money to finance its expenses. And so when it does so, it transfers wealth away from dollar holders involuntarily, just like taxes would. All right, so now that we understand the details of the three different ways that the government can gain purchasing power that can take money away from people, how it can get its income through taxes, borrowing, or printing, we need to look at what happens next. And that is that they spend the money. And this is often overlooked in this conversation as well, because the spending side is just as important as the taking side. Because when the government takes money from any of its sources, it then spends that money, which goes into certain people's pockets. It gets deposited into the bank account of a Social Security beneficiary, or a healthcare provider receiving a Medicare check, or an arms manufacturer, or a fat politician, which means that whether the government is taking its income through taxes, borrowing, or printing, it is financially benefiting some at the expense of others. Taxes, by and large, are at the expense of the middle class. The middle class is who pays most of the taxes, because if you make a very low amount of money, all of the tax benefits for the poverty, the tax deductions, the standard deduction, tax credits for having children, you basically pay very little in taxes at the very low end. Once you get up to the very, very high net worth, the high income earners, you're gonna find ways in order to shield yourself from taxes as well. But it's that middle class to upper middle class that are working the good jobs, the middle management, that are wage earners. They're not running businesses, they don't have real estate, so they really don't have any ways to shield themselves from taxes, and they are fronting the majority of the tax burden. And so the government financing its spending, in other words, enriching those that it chooses through taxes, is disproportionately affecting the middle class. Now, borrowing is going to do the same thing, because borrowing is only able to be financed as a result of being able to tax. And so the end cost is going to be on the middle class again as well, except for the fact that it also rewards the lenders, and in this case, most of the time, it's financial institutions. And so on top of the receivers of the money when the money is spent, we also have to take into account the fact that the money has to be paid back with interest, and many times it's going to be the financial institutions. And of course, a lot of that is going to be passed back through to individuals. Like if you have your money in a high yield savings account, obviously that financial institution can only pay you that money because they're taking your dollars and they're loaning it to the US government. They're keeping a spread. But again, it's not the middle class and the poor people who have a bunch of money in those high yield savings accounts. It's the richer people. And finally, with printing, as we saw earlier, the government is creating new units of currency. And when it spends this money, that is new buying power. That is new money that is coming into the economy that wasn't there before. With taxes and borrowing, what we saw was dollars moved from one area and then got planted in another area. There's no net change in the total number of dollars in circulation when that happens. But if the government prints money in order to finance its expenses, that's new money entering the system. That's an increase in the money supply. That is new demand buying things that wouldn't have that demand otherwise. Because again, if you got your money taken away from taxes, well, the government gets to buy something and now you can't. So the net buying power in the system is the same. But if the government prints money to buy something, you keep your buying power and the government gets new buying power, which means there's more buying power across the system, pushing up prices. There is more demand, which lifts prices to compensate for all the new money. Same amount of goods and services, new money. More money chasing the same amount of goods and services. Which brings us to the next thing that's being ignored in this conversation, which is the resource cost. What do I mean by that? Imagine the government needs to spend a bunch of money to buy steel to build tanks. Well, one iron law of economics is that you can only consume what has been produced. Imagine there's half the wheat this year because there's a big wheat shortage, a big fungus takes over all the wheat crops. Well, we only have half the bread this year that we did last year. Is it possible for us to eat the same amount of bread that we did last year? No, you can only consume what has been produced. We can't magically eat more bread than there is bread. And in the same way, if the government spends money to buy up a bunch of steel to make tanks, that is less steel available for any other projects. Now, the way that this is allocated is, number one, the government's going to get the resources that it wants to get because they're going to get the money they need to buy it. But number two, that's going to be new buying pressure, more demand added into that resource, which is going to drive the cost up. And because the cost is higher, that's going to price out some buyers that would have bought otherwise, but now cannot afford to do so or choose not to do so because of the higher price. So you still, on a net basis, still only have the same amount consumed as was produced. It just changes who gets to consume and what cost the economy consumes the leftover resources. Which means that we actually have two costs that we have to take into account here when we're talking about government taking money and then spending it. We have the financial cost and we have the resource cost. The financial cost of transferring money from some and financially benefiting others. With taxes and borrowing, you're going to see a direct transfer, and then with inflationary financing, you're going to see everyone get their purchasing power diluted. But you also have the resource costs, which is in those resources, those things the government is spending money on, it's going to drive prices up, and it's going to increase scarcity for everybody else for those same things. So now that we really understand and have a solid grasp of how all this works, let's go back to the question that was posed at the beginning. Why does the government borrow if they could simply print the money they need for all their expenses? Well, number one, you could make an argument that it is slightly more moral. If the government is going to take that money and they are going to spend it no matter what, which way would we choose to have them do it? Some would argue that by borrowing it and then paying that borrowing back with more borrowing or taxes, that is the more moral choice than using inflation or using printing. Because it is voluntary, at least at first, it disproportionately affects the middle class instead of the poor, and it is fully visible, which means it's not happening behind the scenes that people are not aware of. It's more transparent. The second reason that the government defaults to borrowing rather than printing, and in many cases rather than increasing taxes, is because it is more politically popular. This is something that literally every administration for decades has done. It just blows up the debt. Wildly more politically popular than taxing. But number three, and I think this is the biggest reason why the government still leans on borrowing instead of trying to lean on printing, which again, the legal loopholes there. They would have to take over the Federal Reserve. They'd have to rewrite the Federal Reserve Act. They would have to take control of the money printer. There'd be problems with that. But let's just say all of those legal issues and the practicality of this was thrown out the window. The reason why they don't do that is because they just haven't yet been tricked into thinking that there is a magic money tree. Yet. Now, obviously, ideally, they would just stop the extraction of wealth. Because remember, money and wealth are not the same thing. And anybody who conflates the two is either ignorant of the facts or they're intentionally deceiving you. But when new money is printed, the way that it works itself through the economy, bidding up prices of assets and goods and services, it is going to disproportionately affect the people who have low savings, which is poor people, wage earners whose wages don't keep up with those rises in the cost of living, poor people, and people who do not hold assets in order to offset that cost of the inflation. Again, poor people. So inflationary financing will always disproportionately affect poor people at the benefit of the people who hold assets and who are not dependent on wages. And so we should be thankful that the government borrows instead of printing and hope that continues for as long as possible. Not that that's ideal, but it's definitely better than the printing alternative. Now, luckily, you don't actually have to be negatively impacted by any of these. If you understand how they work, you can simply get on the right side of the fence so that you are benefited by the way that the world works. Instead of shaking your fist at the world, saying it should be a different way, let's just realize the way it does work and position ourselves to benefit from it. That is exactly why I started Heresy Financial University. That is my paid membership program where I teach you how to grow and protect your wealth, regardless of what happens in the economy, regardless of fiscal policy, of monetary policy, of inflation, of deflation, of market booms or crashes. I teach you everything you need to know about making more money, protecting your wealth, and growing your wealth. I do that through video training material. We do monthly calls, got a community, and I even send out asymmetric trade reports. If you'd like to learn more, click on the link in the description below. As always, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.